Hi, I'm Kim Phillips from the Parent Information Center. Thanks for joining us for Time for Transition. Today we have Heidi Wyman from Transition NH LLC, and Heidi brings her 17 years as a transition consultant for New Hampshire schools and families to us today to talk about transition assessments. So, as we're raising our young adults for life after high school, we're thinking about what are they going to want to do after high school and where are they going to go and how are we going to know what they want to do and include that. So Heidi's going to talk to us today about using transition assessments because they are key considerations in transition planning. Thanks for being here, Heidi.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Kim. Thanks for that introduction. I'm really happy to talk to you today about transition assessment. I think it's one of the most misunderstood aspects of transition planning and can be one of the most valuable tools for families to understand, really just in terms of how it's different from what you might be used to in the special education IEP process, and to understand really the scope of what it can mean when we talk about transition assessment. So really happy to be doing this today for this session in your series for Time for Transition. So I'm going to jump in and talk a little bit about what I'll cover and then go into a little bit more depth as I go along. We ready?
Ready.
All right, great. So really what I want to help you do is understand what is meant when we talk about transition assessment. It's important to know that transition assessment is an ongoing process of assessing strengths, preferences, interests, and needs. And that it's really different from the 3-year evaluation process in the fact that it's ongoing. When we think about evaluation and assessment in special education, we're often talking about that 3-year eval process for eligibility for special ed. And that's sometimes where our minds go when we talk about assessment. Transition assessment is very different from that. It is that ongoing process. And I'll get more into that in a little bit. What we're trying to assess when we're assessing transition is we're trying to assess both current and future. We're trying to gather information about what is known as it relates to today, the current life of the person, of the student, and the future possibility for that same student. So we're trying to gather everything that is possible to know at this point in time related to that transition from today to the future. And we're gathering that information in the areas of education, in the future education, in the areas of future work, and the areas of independent living, or I've said just life here, but we use independent living when we're talking about it in the IEP. And so that's where we want to be thinking about current and future in those 3 areas. And there are a lot of different pieces that go into that. So that's what we're going to go into in a little bit more detail now.
Great.
So when we're thinking about current skills, we want to think about what do we know currently? What does the individual know right now in the areas of self-determination? And that's self-determination is really about having the ability to make informed choices for yourself. So does the person have the ability to make informed choices? Does this child, does this student have the ability to make informed choices about themselves? And that sometimes we call that capacity. Everybody has a different capacity to make choices for themselves. Some people are really skilled at it from an early age. Some people, it takes longer to build the skill to be able to make good choices for their lives. Some people never learn that skill, right? So, right, really what we're talking about when we want to assess current skills for self-determination is where does this student fall in their ability to make informed choices for themselves? And then do they have the chance to do that? So when we're thinking about current skills and self-determination, we're really thinking about how do we know where they fall in terms of their ability to do this? And what else do they need to know? And then when we're thinking about current academic skills, well, that's really what school is all about. Usually have a lot of academic data or academic information for transition. Sometimes we have less information about career and work readiness. And that can be a really important piece of the transition assessment process, where we're starting to figure out what do they understand about the world of work, what kind of experience do they have in the world of work, and where do they really need to build some skill in that area of career and work. And then finally, independent living, which is not an area that all IEPs delve into. For some students, the team decides this kid's going to be okay. They're going to struggle with normal teenage stuff, but they're going to be okay. We aren't going to get involved in their independent living skills in this IEP. That happens sometimes. In many cases, the IEP team decides we are going to do some skill building when it comes to independent living. But that's part of the reason that we're gathering data, transition assessment data, about their independent living skills, is so we can decide, do we need to add something to their high school career to build independent living skill, or do we think they're going to be okay? Those decisions should be made based on transition assessment data that the team uses to decide if there should be activities that are happening in school related to independent living skill. So assessing current skills, one function of transition assessment. Another function of transition assessment is to create future goals and identify those needs that I was just talking about. So when we're talking about the future goals, I'm going to use IEP language here. We're talking about measurable post-secondary goals. And so transition assessment is required for the development of measurable post-secondary goals. Measurable post-secondary goals are goals for life after high school, when the student will go do whatever they do after high school. So it is required that there be measurable post-secondary goals in the area of post-secondary education and training, post-secondary employment, and independent living if the team determines that a post-secondary independent living goal is needed. So one of the reasons that we're using transition assessment data is to think about what should those goals sound like. The student's voice must be primary in developing those goals. Schools are required by law to use the student's voice when they're creating measurable post-secondary goals. And they are required to show how they got the student's voice when they created those goals. So transition assessment, and again, I'm going to defer to later when I say, I'll tell you more about this later, but informal transition assessment is valid transition assessment. Asking the question, what do you want to be when you grow up? Writing the answers down, and then using those answers to develop measurable post-secondary goals is what schools are expected to do. They are expected to interview students and ask them those questions and use the answers to develop goals for life after high school. They should also gather all kinds of other data too. But that's really, they are required to use that student's voice to develop those post-secondary goals in the areas of employment, education and training, and independent living, if applicable. Those same transition assessments can also be used to figure out, well, what does the student need to do? So this is for any of you who've ever heard me talk before, I do this all the time. Goals for life after high school, top of the staircase. Where the student is right now, in relationship to those goals, bottom of the staircase. And transition planning is everything in between getting to the top of the staircase and where we are now. Transition assessment should inform every single section of that process. So now, going back to what I said earlier about this being an ongoing process. So ideally, when we're talking about transition assessment, we are using transition assessment as part of an ongoing process where we are assessing the student's current skills. We are creating or updating their future goals, identifying their needs. We are putting services in place and activities in place to help them advance their skills and knowledge. We're learning from those activities that are happening at school, those activities that are happening at home. We're doing some more assessment of where the student is. We're revising our goals for life after high school and identifying new needs this year because we'd addressed last year's in this perfect world that we're living in. And then we move on to the next stage and we start it all again. So it's an ongoing process where we're constantly thinking about where are we now in relationship to the goal we want to achieve. Let's update our goals, let's update our IEP, and let's address new needs that we've identified. Let's put those things in place and then let's look at it again. And that is an ongoing process of transition assessment and transition services. And that's the best case scenario for a transition planning process. And it's transition assessment is the underlying thread throughout that whole process. What we're trying to accomplish here when we're doing this transition assessment this way, here's me trying to move on to my next slide. Oh, there it is. Okay. So the purpose of transition assessment is to help students make informed choices. The idea here is that transition planning should help them understand how to set a goal, how to realistically understand themselves in relationship to that goal, and then how to set a course of action related to that goal. This is really also the time to start having them take more of a leadership role in the transition planning process. And transition assessment can help do that by helping them describe who they are. When a student is able to identify, here's what I like, here's what I don't like, here's what I'm good at, here's what's hard for me. If a student participates in a process where somebody else asks them those questions and then they answer, and then the student goes into a meeting and says all those things out loud, they are starting to take charge of their own transition and their own planning process. And it's an instrumental component of becoming an adult. And that's how we can use transition assessment and integrate it into that process in a way to really help the student start to learn how to make informed choices, take charge of their life, and start to understand what skills are needed for their post-school work and life when we can integrate it into the overall IEP process. Kim, you and I have done this together a lot. And so I'd love to just pause before I move into this next section where we're going to talk a little bit about formal and informal transition assessment options. And I just want to maybe pause here for a second and ask you, does this feel like we're hitting the high points? Are there some pieces that I could go back to a little bit?
I think that this is great, and it really lays the groundwork for why transition assessment is so important, because as you're setting those goals, you want to make sure that do everything you can to ensure that the goals are attainable and you're supporting those goals every step along the way and going back and seeing where the progress is and, scaling any kinds of interventions or transition services as a student progresses. Yeah, absolutely. I think that is, transition plans can be so incredibly individualized if they are treated that way, right? If they are started in a timely way and really focus in on the individual needs of the student and where they need to build skills, because that just varies so greatly for every student. That it really does, has great potential, but it also takes a lot of intention on the part of the team. So, right. And I think as you get into explaining the difference between formal and informal, it's going to really all come together about how individualized it is. Okay, great. Yeah. Well, that's a nice segue. Let's do that. So formal and informal assessment, both are valid. Both transition assessment can be both formal and informal. Both are considered very valid types of transition assessment, and both are typically needed to make a meaningful decision about future goals. So I'm going to describe a little bit about what is meant by each, and as we get nearer to the end, give you some specific examples. I also want to point out that where you locate this video, you should probably also be able to find some links
to resources that I'll be exploring at the end. So as I'm bringing up some examples, go back to where you first found this video and see what other attachments are available at that location. We will be making every effort to make sure those are easy for you to find.
And those will be available for folks who might be viewing this offsite. Those handouts will be available on the Parent Information Center's website, which is picnh.org.
So formal transition assessment. Formal assessments assess a wide variety of skill levels in various areas. That could be a vocational, academic, or social area of the individual. We're usually talking about a published test. We're talking about a test that scores the individual's result against other students. So we aren't just concerned about their knowledge, we're concerned about their knowledge as it compares to another, to the total student body. And this is really a starting point. It's a way of really comparing ourselves to others, which, personally is my least favorite thing to do. But this is where, when we're trying to determine what course is best to set a child on, that can be a good starting place. It can also, it's not always popular, right? Because we don't always love the way things have been done in the past. So we want to recognize that just because this test score says that a child should do this thing, because that's how we've always done it, is not a good individualized transition planning process, right? So really this formal assessment is a starting point to understand, based on standardized testing, where does this individual lie? Where do their results lie? And what does that mean to us? It is by no means the start and end point. And I want to make that very clear from the beginning. Published testing is just a starting point for transition assessment, but it is the starting point that is most commonly available. And so it's a good idea to start with looking at, where does this individual stand in regards to where other students have scored, and the course of study and the future plans that is typical for a student who might score in this way. So specific examples of formal assessments, we might be talking about learning style inventories, academic achievement tests, adaptive behavior scales, aptitude tests, and interest inventories. Those are typically formal assessments, and they will provide results that help you figure out where the student stands with regard to other students. That doesn't set the future goal by any stretch. It simply helps you figure out where they are in comparison to others who have taken these same tests. Using that data and figuring out how to apply it is a team decision and a team practice. So understand that formal assessment is valuable and useful, but it is only a starting point. And these are some examples of what you might be looking at for formal assessment from your school. When we talk about informal assessment, we're talking about an assessment that might observe the student in various academic and work experiences, where they're talking about their likes and their dislikes. It gives them a chance to be trying something that might be interesting to them, and then having somebody evaluate what their preferences and strengths and needs were when they were trying out this thing that was interesting to them. It can be teacher made. It often does not result in a score. It's more what would say anecdotal information, more of a story about how the student reacted. But it's one of the most vital pieces of information, as long as it's part of a larger planning process. And I say that part about this part of a larger planning process because I've been asked over 17 years on many occasions to come in and do a transition assessment. And in the early years of my career, I tried to do what I thought was going to be a useful and meaningful transition assessment for the individual. What I found and what I understand now is that if you don't integrate that into a larger planning process, you're asking a student to share, a teenager to share their hopes and dreams, their likes, their dislikes. If you don't then include that in a larger planning process, you're doing things that really disconnect the teenager from what you want them to be a part of. It's really important, if you're going to ask a student to share what they think, and then they actually do, that you make sure you bring those words forward and that they see those words reflected in the planning process going forward. If that doesn't happen, then you've actually done damage to your relationship with that student, and you've done damage to that student buying in on this transition planning process. So when I say that, it's vital information. These informal assessments are vital information when the team is prepared to bring that into the transition planning process. So you have to be prepared for the student to say something that you don't like. You think that there are many, many times when I've been in part of a transition planning process where there have been goals for the student, goals for life after high school, that were not necessarily the student's goals. They were goals that somebody else thought the student should have. And those goals are really, I think, unlikely to be attained. I think it's pretty unlikely to think that any teenager or young person in their 20s is going to work really hard to achieve goals that aren't things that they're passionate about. So part of what we're trying to figure out when we're working on transition assessment is, what is this young person passionate about? What do they care about enough to get out of bed and go to work every day for? What do they care about enough to take the risk of going into a setting that maybe is somewhere they're not comfortable? What matters to them that will enough to help them find the motivation to take the steps needed to become a functioning and independent adult? That's going to look different for every student. And that means that the transition assessment is going to look different for every student.
So, I just want to jump in and say that I agree that sometimes students will have an idea or an opinion or skills to do something in life that somebody might not have thought of before, or somebody might not have thought of seriously before, and to take those words into consideration and to really plan around that. It's so important.
It really is, Kim. I think it can't be said enough that the intent behind the transition section of the IEP is just that. It's supposed to be an opportunity for students to start finding their voice, using their voice, and taking a lead role. And there's no like magic transition assessment anywhere that tells you exactly what this kid's going to be when they grow up. It just doesn't work like that. Helping them find their voice is actually, I think, the strongest predictor of them being able to make those kinds of decisions as they get older. And so, yeah, it can't be overstated.
And that goes for all levels of disability, really raising expectations and thinking of the student's goals in those circumstances. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think that that's one that does speak to the kinds of transition assessment and the different ways that we might do transition assessment. And this is a good time to move into a couple of the examples that I will be sharing with you, Kim, and that you'll be making available. One of the things that I've seen, whoops, hold on one second while I just figure out technology. So one of the great things about transition assessment, and when we're talking about informal transition assessment, we're talking about a real flexible process. When we're talking about formal transition assessment, it's less flexible. We're talking about standardized tools, standardized assessments. There's not a lot of wiggle room. You know, you take that assessment the way that it's intended to be taken. When we talk about informal transition assessment, we really have this great opportunity to find the tool that gives the person the chance to say what they think. And so that can be, it can be a one-on-one conversation and the case manager writes it down. It can be the person recording a video straight to a screen because they're most comfortable answering those questions to the screen and not to a person. It can be a person-centered planning process where there's a whole team that comes together who knows the individual really well. And even though that person might be nonverbal, this team knows that person well enough to be able to respond to likes and dislikes and what works and doesn't work. And so the informal transition assessment process is really where we get some of the most important information, no matter what the type of disability. It's where the person really says who they are. And if it's done right, they felt heard.
Right. Agreed. Thanks.
So here are some examples of transition assessment that are available. So that informal interview that I mentioned before is, I created a format for that informal interview because that was one thing that I found over the years. Schools often had that conversation with students, but they didn't have the documentation for it. And so this is just a way to document that informal conversation where students can talk about what they're good at, what their challenges are, the best thing they could accomplish when they get older, what they want their life to look like, what they'll do for work, and whether or not they will go on to get some, go on to college or get some other type of ongoing education, and what their plans are for independent living. Many of these questions get the most good data out of them when students are allowed to answer, parents are allowed to answer, and then somebody helps both sides see that they've got different answers. Right? So that's something to keep in mind in terms of transition assessment planning that you might be doing at home. These are things that you can do on your own and share with the school and ask them to make sure that this is used to develop post-secondary goals. You can also think about a tool like this. So you'll see this student input form, just some very straightforward questions, which works for some of us when it comes to planning. Some of us might be intrigued by a format like this, which is called the Life Trajectory Worksheet. This is a tool that is utilized by the New Hampshire Area Agency System. And that is depending on where you're coming to today's session from in the state, we have 10, is it still 10? 10 area agencies in the state of New Hampshire.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. So we have 10 regional area agencies in the state of New Hampshire, and those are services for people with developmental disabilities. And so if you aren't connected to your area agency for developmental services and your child has a developmental disability, that's something that you want to be doing sooner rather than later. And when I say sooner, 14 is not too young. 14 and even earlier is a good time to be checking in with them to understand how they operate when it comes to transition planning. That's a different session though. The Life Trajectory Workshop is what you want to think about here is this is where you just start to describe. You see here, it says everyone wants a good life. The bubbles on the right will help you think about what a good life means for you or your family member and identifying what you know you don't want. So I'm going to just scroll over here. Here's where you might put in a description for a good life. And here's where you might describe, here's what I don't want. Sometimes when you're first getting started on this process, I've found that sometimes it's easier to start with what you don't want because the scope of what you might want feels really huge. So sometimes it's easy to say, here's what I'm afraid of. Here's what here's what I don't want to have happen. Here's what I want to make sure we avoid. And that's okay. Start with what you don't want, but then flip that around and think about what is it that we do want? What is our vision for a good life? Because that's one of the things that adult service providers are going to want to know. they're going to want to know, well, what kind of life are you dreaming of? What kind of life are you hoping for? And then they will start to plan with you around how to fit services into that. That is a more person-centered approach to planning for life after high school versus the idea of knowing what services there are so you can make a plan to get those services. The services want you to say what a vision for a good life is for you, and then they'll help you figure out how services might fit into that. And this second tool, which is very much related to this same worksheet, is a vision planning tool, but really breaks down different domains or aspects or parts of a person's life, and what the vision for the future might look like in each one of those areas. And so you'll see listed on the left: employment, community living, social and spirituality, healthy living, safety and security, citizenship and advocacy, supports for family, and supports and services. So this is a way to sort of think about the individual in parts, right? Because we're all different, and what matters to us as an individual varies from person to person. So this gives you a chance to really think about, what parts have we thought about? What parts have we not thought about? What do we think we know? What do we not know? And that can also really give you some good impetus to think about, what else do we need to assess? So working on documents like this helps you figure out what you know, what you don't know, and also just really determine what direction you need to go in next in terms of skill building for the individual, assessment, and just generally other activities. Sometimes it can also help you figure out what you don't need to be prioritizing anymore. So yeah, so I think that's, one more thing I wanted to, before I click off the sharing here. This is just another resource that will be included. These are all free links on the web that can help with identifying strengths, interests, preferences, and needs for the future. It is broken up into different categories. So employment, education, independent living, and self-determination. And then these at the bottom are places you can go that just have tons and tons of different resources. I often get the question about what are the best transition assessment resources. I think that the best transition assessment resources are the ones that have a very clear purpose. Why are we doing this assessment? What are we trying to learn? That is actually the more important aspect of transition assessment. If you know what you're trying to learn, it's a lot easier to dig through all the different free tools that are available. So think about what it is that you're trying to figure out before you get overwhelmed by all of the things that you could start figuring out when you're digging for transition assessment. So I'm going to stop sharing now. Those are the primary things I wanted to make sure I covered. How do you think we did, Kim?
My turn to unmute. Sorry about that. I think we did great. I think you did great, Heidi, really just talking about the different kinds of assessments, their purpose, and how to continually assess. I want to go back to that because we left that in the middle, but to continue to go back and do those assessments. And see where the growth is and where the supports need to be in place. Yeah. Thanks. And what a great list of resources for folks links to try out. So don't feel overwhelmed if you're looking at that page of resources. There's tons of them there. They're downloadable. You can go visit them, at your leisure, and you can dip your toe in or you can jump in. So thanks for sharing all that.
Happy to. They're all free. Everything that's shared on that resource sheet is free, which doesn't mean that the ones that cost something are better or worse. It's really, like I said, figuring out what you need answers to when you're getting started with that.
Right. Thanks.
My pleasure.
And I'm sure, Heidi, you'd be glad to answer questions if anybody watching this has some, and they could visit your website at www.transitionnh.com.
That's correct. Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks so much.
My pleasure.
And I'll look forward to talking to you again soon in the future.
Excellent. Thank you, Kim. Bye, everybody.